The maintenance worker noticed it first, a faint, sweet smell like overripe mangoes mixed with metal, drifting from the presidential office's air conditioning vent. It was 5:43 a.m. on October 9, 2024, and Jacques Caillé had been cleaning the presidential palace of Burkina Faso for 11 years. In that time, he had learned to read the building like a familiar book, knowing every sound that echoed through its marble corridors, every shadow that played across its walls, and every scent that belonged, or didn't belong, in its sacred spaces. This smell didn't belong. What Jacques did in the next few hours would save President Ibrahim Traoré's life and expose an assassination plot so sophisticated that international investigators would later call it the Invisible Death, a murder weapon designed to kill without a trace, leaving behind only the appearance of natural illness. For 23 days, someone had been methodically pumping poison into the president's office through the air conditioning system. The dosage had been calculated with scientific precision to kill not in hours or days, but in exactly 30 days, making death appear as mysterious illness rather than assassination. President Traoré had already been breathing this toxic cocktail for 3 weeks. According to the assassin's timeline, he had exactly 7 days left to live, and he didn't even know he was dying. Jacques Caillé wasn't supposed to be in the executive wing that October morning. His normal schedule had him cleaning the presidential offices on Tuesdays and Thursdays, but his colleague Samuel Ouattara had called in sick with what he claimed was malaria. Jacques needed the extra overtime hours to cover his daughter Aisha's school fees at the technical college in Ouagadougou, where she was studying to become an electrical engineer, a profession that would lift her far above her father's station. As he pushed his cleaning cart down the polished marble hallway, its wheels squeaking slightly in the pre-dawn silence, Jacques was thinking about nothing more complicated than finishing his work efficiently and getting home before the morning traffic snarled the roads between the government district and his modest house in the Cécine neighborhood. The palace at this hour was a different place than during the busy daylight, peaceful, almost reverent, with only the distant hum of air conditioning and the soft footsteps of security guards making their rounds. But when he opened the heavy wooden door to President Traoré's office, and that strange, sweet, metallic smell hit him like a physical presence, every instinct from his previous life suddenly awakened. Because before Jacques Caillé pushed a mop for survival, before political persecution had destroyed his career and reduced him to janitorial work, he had been Dr. Jacques Caillé, a chemical engineer with a degree from the École Polytechnique in Paris and a promising career in Burkina Faso's nascent petrochemical industry. That career ended abruptly 12 years ago when he had publicly criticized a French company's environmental practices at a gold mine near Kédougou. His comments, published in a local newspaper, had somehow found their way to the French embassy. Within weeks, his government contracts were canceled, his research funding was cut, and he found himself blacklisted from every technical position in the country. The message was clear. Criticism of French interests would not be tolerated, regardless of its scientific validity. So the man who had once analyzed molecular structures for a living became a man who mopped floors for survival. But 12 years of pushing a cleaning cart hadn't erased his scientific training, and now that training was screaming warnings. Jacques knew that smell, not exactly, but close enough to set off every alarm in his chemically trained mind. During his studies in Paris, he had worked extensively with organophosphates, the broad family of chemicals that included everything from agricultural pesticides to military-grade nerve agents. This smell carried that same underlying molecular signature, sweet but wrong, natural but unmistakably synthetic, like fruit that had been artificially enhanced and then left to rot in a laboratory. His first rational thought was that perhaps a small animal, a rat or bird, had died somewhere in the ventilation system. The palace was old, built during the colonial period, and its walls and ductwork harbored all sorts of small creatures. But as Jacques moved deeper into the office, approaching President Traoré's massive mahogany desk that sat directly beneath the main air conditioning vent, the smell grew stronger and more chemically distinct. This wasn't biological decay. This was industrial chemistry. Jacques found himself facing a dilemma that would have been unthinkable in his former life as a respected professional. If he reported his suspicions through normal channels and was wrong, he would almost certainly lose his job. A janitor claiming that someone was trying to poison the president? They would laugh at him, or worse, suspect him of the crime himself. In the current political climate, with President Traoré's government under constant pressure from foreign interests and domestic opponents, paranoia ran high. An accusation without evidence could easily be turned against the accuser. But if he was right and said nothing, if he simply finished his cleaning and walked away, then President Ibrahim Traoré would die, and with him would die the hope that had returned to Burkina Faso after decades of despair. Traoré wasn't just another African president to Jacques. This was the leader who had stood up to the international mining companies that had been stripping the country's gold while leaving its people in poverty. This was the man who had expelled French military advisors and torn up exploitative contracts on live television. This was the president who had given people like Jacques, educated citizens crushed by the neo-colonial system, reason to believe that their country could be more than a source of cheap labor and raw materials for foreign powers. The decision crystallized in Jacques' mind with the clarity that comes from moral certainty. He would not stand by and watch this man die, regardless of the personal cost. But rather than report his suspicions through official channels where they might be buried or dismissed, Jacques made a decision that would later be credited with saving not just the president's life, but potentially the entire direction of his country's future. He would go directly to someone he trusted, his nephew Antoine Ouedraogo, who worked in the palace's medical unit. Antoine Ouedraogo was 28 years old, the pride of his extended family, and the first person in 3 generations to earn a university degree. His specialization in toxicology from the University of Ouagadougou had landed him a position in the presidential palace's medical unit, where he was responsible for maintaining the sophisticated health monitoring equipment that had been installed as part of enhanced security protocols following several assassination attempts on African leaders in recent years. When his uncle Jacques appeared at the medical unit at 6:15 that morning, still wearing his maintenance coveralls and speaking in urgent, hushed tones about chemical smells and poison, Antoine's first instinct was disbelief. His uncle had always been prone to overthinking, a trait that had probably contributed to his political troubles years earlier. But as Jacques described the smell in precise chemical terms, organophosphate derivatives with an unusual sweetening agent, possibly designed to mask detection, Antoine realized this wasn't the paranoid ramblings of an overworked janitor. This was the professional assessment of a trained chemist. "Uncle, you realize what you're suggesting," Antoine said, glancing around nervously to ensure they weren't overheard. "If we test the president's office without authorization and find nothing, we'll both be arrested for violating security protocols. They'll assume we were planning something ourselves." Jacques nodded grimly. "And if we don't test and the president dies from something we could have prevented, how will we live with ourselves?" Antoine was already mentally cataloging the equipment he would need. The presidential medical unit had been equipped with state-of-the-art detection devices just 6 months earlier, including a portable mass spectrometer capable of identifying chemical compounds at concentrations as low as parts per billion. The equipment had been purchased from a German company as part of President Traoré's initiative to reduce dependence on French suppliers, even for sensitive security equipment. "We have maybe an hour," Antoine said, checking his watch, "before 7:30 when the security shift changes and the executive wing becomes completely restricted." They moved quickly through the palace's back corridors, Jacques' intimate knowledge of the building's service routes proving invaluable. The palace was beginning to stir with early morning activity, kitchen staff preparing breakfast, security guards conducting routine checks, administrative workers arriving for early meetings. But the executive wing remained quiet, its heavy doors sealed and guarded. Jacques' maintenance credentials got them past the first checkpoint, but their hearts pounded as they approached President Traoré's office. If they were caught inside with chemical detection equipment, no explanation would save them from charges of attempted assassination. Antoine's hands trembled slightly as he calibrated the portable mass spectrometer, a device no larger than a briefcase, but containing technology worth more than most Burkinabe families earned in a decade. Jacques stood watch at the office door, his mop and bucket providing perfect cover for his presence, his ears attuned to any sound of approaching footsteps. The first reading made Antoine gasp audibly, then clamp his hand over his horror. "Dimethyl-methyl-phosphonate," he whispered, his face draining of color. "Uncle, this is a precursor to sarin gas, but it's been modified somehow, buffered with something to slow its biological effect." He moved the sensor around the room methodically, taking readings at different heights and locations. The concentration was highest near President Traoré's desk, specifically around the main air conditioning vent directly above the chair where the president would sit for hours each day, reading intelligence reports, signing legislation, conducting video conferences with other African leaders, slowly breathing in death with every inhalation. "How long?" Jack asked, though he dreaded the answer. Antoine was performing rapid calculations on his smartphone, consulting toxicology databases and pharmacokinetic models. At this concentration, with prolonged daily exposure of approximately 6 to 8 hours, maybe 30 days from first contact to irreversible organ failure, it would manifest as fatigue, confusion, then respiratory distress, finally cardiac arrest. By the time symptoms became severe enough to hospitalize, the damage to his nervous system would be irreversible. Any autopsy would likely conclude death by unknown tropical disease or stress-induced cardiac event. They stared at each other in horror, the implications sinking in. This wasn't a crime of passion or political desperation. This was a carefully planned, scientifically sophisticated assassination designed to look like natural death. The level of resources and expertise required pointed to state-level involvement, and, given President Traoré's recent conflicts with French interests, the likely culprit was obvious. Finding someone trustworthy enough to report their discovery to required careful consideration. The poisoning clearly required inside access to the palace's air conditioning systems, detailed knowledge of the president's daily schedule, and sophisticated chemical expertise. This was an operation planned and executed by people with high-level access to the government, possibly reaching into the security apparatus itself. One wrong move could result in their deaths, either blamed for the poisoning themselves or simply disappeared for knowing too much. Jacques made another crucial decision. "We go to Captain Beatrice Yamayogu." Captain Yamayogu was unique in President Traoré's security detail, the only woman to hold such a high position, promoted by the president himself over significant resistance from the old guard of security officials who had served previous regimes. Her background was impeccable from a loyalty standpoint. Daughter of a rural teacher, educated on government scholarships, with no connections to the French colonial administration or the mining companies that had dominated Burkina Faso's economy for decades. If anyone in the security apparatus could be trusted with this information, it was her. They found Captain Yamayogu beginning her morning security briefing at 7:15 a.m. When she saw a janitor and a medical technician approaching her with urgent, fearful expressions, her hand instinctively moved toward her sidearm. But as Antoine showed her the mass spectrometer readings and explained their significance, her professional skepticism transformed into cold, focused alarm. "Show me the data again," she commanded, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what she was being told. Antoine pulled up the chemical analysis on his device's screen. Dimethyl methylphosphonate, concentration ranging from 15 to 23 parts per million in the air around the president's desk. This compound is a known precursor to organophosphate nerve agents, but it's been chemically modified to extend its biological half-life and reduce immediate symptoms. Captain Yamayogu had trained with international counterterrorism units. She recognized the implications immediately. "How long has this been happening?" Antoine consulted the spectrometer's data analysis function, which could estimate exposure duration based on chemical degradation patterns and accumulation levels. "Based on the molecular breakdown we're seeing, I estimate approximately 23 days of continuous exposure during working hours. If the compound is designed for a 30-day kill window, the president has maybe 1 week before symptoms become irreversible." Yamayogu's response demonstrated why President Traoré had promoted her over more senior candidates. Without hesitation, she activated Protocol 9, a lockdown procedure that immediately sealed the executive wing and summoned only the most trusted members of the presidential security detail, officers who had been personally vetted by Traoré himself and whose family safety was guaranteed by the state. Then she did something that surprised both Jacques and Antoine. She called President Traoré directly, on his secure personal line. "Mr. President, this is Captain Yamayogu. Do not enter your office this morning. I'm coming to your residence immediately with medical personnel. We have a Code Black situation." Code Black was the designation for an active assassination attempt against the president. President Ibrahim Traoré received the call while having his customary morning coffee on the terrace of his private residence, a modest house within the palace compound that he had insisted on maintaining, rather than moving to the grander presidential mansion built by his predecessor. He had been reading intelligence reports about French military movements in neighboring countries and preparing for a video conference with the presidents of Mali and Niger about economic cooperation agreements that would reduce their collective dependence on French trade networks. 20 minutes later, in a secure room in the presidential residence that was regularly swept for surveillance devices, President Traoré sat calmly as Antoine explained the chemical analysis findings. The president's reaction surprised everyone present. Rather than panic or outrage, he displayed the measured thoughtfulness that had made him respected even by his political opponents. 23 days, he said quietly, setting down the toxicology report. That would mean the poisoning began on September 16th. He consulted his smartphone calendar, scrolling back through recent entries. The day after I announced the currency reform initiative. The day after I expelled the French financial advisors who were helping us manage our gold reserves. Dr. Fadi Daouso, the president's personal physician who had been summoned as soon as the lockdown began, was conducting blood tests using portable diagnostic equipment. His face was grim as the results appeared on his tablet screen. "Mr. President, your blood chemistry shows elevated acetylcholinesterase inhibition consistent with organophosphate exposure. Your nervous system is being systematically damaged. We need to begin chelation therapy immediately to bind and eliminate the toxins from your system." But President Traoré raised his hand, his expression thoughtful rather than fearful. "Doctor, how long do we have before treatment becomes ineffective?" 48 hours at most, sir. Beyond that point, the damage to your nervous system could become permanent, regardless of treatment." Traoré nodded and turned to Captain Yamayogu. 48 hours to find our assassin and understand the full scope of this conspiracy. But we do this quietly, methodically. If they know we've discovered the poison, they might activate backup plans or destroy evidence that could help us identify other conspirators. The investigation that followed over the next 2 days would become a masterclass in counterintelligence, demonstrating how a small African nation could outmaneuver the sophisticated intelligence operations of a major power. Rather than launching a massive security sweep that would inevitably alert the conspirators, Captain Yamayogu assembled a small team of investigators whose loyalty was beyond question. They began with the air conditioning system itself, treating it as a crime scene requiring forensic-level analysis. The presidential palace's HVAC system was a complex network of ducts, filters, and circulation units installed during a major renovation 5 years earlier. The maintenance contract was held by Climate Solutions International, a company that had been servicing government buildings across Francophone Africa for over a decade without any security incidents. But when investigators examined the maintenance logs with fresh eyes, they discovered an anomaly that had been hiding in plain sight. On September 15th, 1 day before the estimated start of the poisoning, there had been an emergency repair to the air circulation system serving the executive wing. The work order bore the signature of Robert Kafando, the Deputy Chief of Palace Operations, a man with 20 years of government service and impeccable credentials. But when questioned, however, Kafando claimed no knowledge of any emergency repair. His signature had been expertly forged, but forged nonetheless. More suspiciously, the palace's main security cameras had experienced a technical malfunction during the 3-hour window when the repair supposedly took place, showing only static interference, a level of electronic sophistication that suggested professional intelligence involvement. The investigation team, working around the clock while President Traoré began receiving life-saving medical treatment, traced the work order to a technician named Paul Bongu. Bongu had been employed by Climate Solutions International for only 6 months, hired through what appeared to be normal channels, but without the extensive background checks typically required for personnel working on government facilities. When security forces arrived at Bongu's apartment to arrest him, they found it completely empty, cleaned out with professional thoroughness, but not quite perfectly. Hidden behind a loose bathroom tile, investigators discovered a single glass ampule containing residue of the modified chemical compound that had been used to poison the president. It was physical evidence linking Bongu directly to the assassination attempt. But the man himself had vanished as completely as if he had never existed. President Traoré, despite the poison still circulating in his system and the intensive medical treatment he was receiving, insisted on being personally briefed on every aspect of the investigation. His involvement wasn't merely symbolic. His decades of experience in international business and finance, gained before entering politics, proved invaluable in understanding the conspiracy structure. He didn't vanish on his own, the president observed during one midnight briefing session, his voice slightly hoarse from the chelation therapy, but his mind sharp. Someone with substantial resources is protecting him, probably moving him out of the country through diplomatic channels. Captain Yamayogo expanded the investigation to examine every financial transaction involving Climate Solutions International over the past year. What they discovered was a web of shell companies, offshore accounts, and cryptocurrency transfers that led to some shocking destinations. 2 weeks before Paul Bongu had been hired, Climate Solutions International had received a payment of 2.3 million euros from a company called Sahel Development Partners, registered in Cyprus. When investigators traced Sahel Development Partners through 3 layers of corporate ownership, using financial intelligence techniques learned from international law enforcement training programs, they found it ultimately led back to a familiar entity, Constellation Mining Corporation. Constellation Mining was the same French company whose exclusive gold extraction contract President Traoré had dramatically torn up on live television 6 months earlier, after discovering that the company had been systematically underreporting its extraction volumes and paying royalties based on falsified production figures. The contract cancellation had cost Constellation Mining an estimated $400 million annually and had served as a model for other African nations seeking to renegotiate exploitative mining agreements. But the financial trail revealed something even more disturbing. Climate Solutions International had received similar payments from Constellation Mining-linked entities before and after major political changes in 3 other African countries over the past 2 years. In each case, the payments preceded the deaths of political leaders who had been opposing French corporate interests, deaths that had all been attributed to natural causes or accidents. The breakthrough in the investigation came from an unexpected source. The presidential palace's security system included a redundant backup network that few people knew about, installed 3 years ago by Chinese contractors as part of a technical cooperation agreement. This secondary system operated independently from the main security network and had captured what the primary cameras had missed. At 2:47 a.m. on September 15th, the Chinese-installed cameras showed 3 figures entering the mechanical room that housed the air conditioning systems for the executive wing. 2 were dressed in maintenance coveralls with faces completely covered, but the 3rd figure, who appeared to be supervising the operation, made a fatal error in tradecraft. For just a moment, apparently believing himself unobserved, he lowered his protective mask to smoke a cigarette. The face captured by the high-definition Chinese camera was unmistakably that of Michel Sandogo, the Deputy Minister of the Interior. Sandogo was a familiar figure in Burkina Faso's government, having served in various ministerial positions for 15 years. He had survived multiple regime changes, presenting himself as a competent technocrat focused on administrative efficiency rather than political ideology. He had even publicly supported some of President Traoré's reforms, giving speeches about the need for African self-determination and economic independence. But the financial trail revealed something even more disturbing. Bank records obtained through international law enforcement cooperation showed regular deposits into accounts controlled by Sandogo's wife, payments that corresponded precisely with major policy decisions favoring French corporate interests. He hadn't just been bought, he had been a French intelligence asset for years. Arresting Sandogo immediately would have been satisfying, but strategically foolish. As Deputy Minister of the Interior, he controlled significant security resources and had his own network of loyalists throughout the government. If alerted to the investigation, he could flee the country or, worse, activate other sleeper agents for a more direct assault on the government. President Traoré, now 42 hours into his medical treatment and showing signs of recovery, devised an elegant trap that would allow them to monitor Sandogo's network while gathering additional evidence. On October 11th, President Traoré called an emergency cabinet meeting. He appeared healthy and energetic, showing no outward signs of the intensive medical treatment he was receiving. The announced topic was new security protocols for all government buildings in response to general terrorist threats identified by intelligence services. Michel Sandogo attended the meeting, sitting just 3 seats away from the man he had tried to murder, participating normally in discussions about protecting the very person he had been paid to kill. His performance was flawless, concerned, engaged, offering thoughtful suggestions about security improvements. As the meeting concluded, President Traoré made what appeared to be an offhand announcement that sent chills down Sandogo's spine, although his expression remained perfectly composed. I should mention that our new chemical detection systems identified traces of an unidentified compound in the air conditioning system of my office yesterday. Probably just industrial contamination from construction work nearby, but I want a full investigation to ensure there's no health risk. He paused, looking directly at Sandogo. Michel, since building security falls under Interior Ministry jurisdiction, I'm putting you in charge of the investigation. I want a comprehensive report within 72 hours. It was a masterful psychological operation. Sandogo now had to pretend to investigate his own assassination attempt. But more importantly, his response to this assignment would reveal the extent of his panic and potentially expose his co-conspirators. Within hours of being assigned to investigate the contamination in President Traoré's office, Michel Sandogo made his crucial mistake. Using what he believed was a secure encrypted phone provided by his French handlers, he placed a call to a number in Abidjan, Côte d'Ivoire. Unknown to Sandogo, Captain Yameogu's team had been monitoring all his communications since discovering his face on the security footage. The conversation, though conducted in code, was transparently desperate. The product was detected earlier than anticipated. The client is requesting immediate consultation about delivery schedules. The response from Abidjan was equally coded, but clear. Stand by for extraction procedures. Maintain normal operations until contact. More damaging was Sandogo's immediate response to his investigative assignment. Instead of conducting a genuine inquiry that might accidentally uncover real evidence, he began systematically destroying records and attempting to contact other members of his network to warn them. His first call went to Paul Bongu's former supervisor at Climate Solutions International, a conversation that revealed the assassination plot was just one part of a broader destabilization campaign. His second call was to a colonel in the Presidential Guard, informing him to prepare for contingencies. Each call, monitored and recorded by counterintelligence teams, provided additional pieces of the conspiracy puzzle. The coordinated arrests began at 3 a.m. on October 12th, exactly 48 hours after the poison's discovery. Michel Sandogo was taken from his home, not by regular police, but by a special military unit answerable only to President Traoré. The timing ensured that he had no opportunity to destroy evidence or alert remaining conspirators. In Sandogo's house, investigators found a treasure trove of incriminating evidence that he had apparently been too panicked to destroy. Encrypted hard drives containing communications with French intelligence officers, detailed bank statements showing payments from Constellation mining subsidiaries, and most chillingly, a comprehensive timeline of the assassination plot written in his own handwriting. The timeline was clinically detailed. Day 1 to 15, baseline exposure, no symptoms expected. Day 16 to 20, possible mild fatigue, attributable to stress. Day 21 to 25, increasing fatigue, possible headaches. Day 26 to 28, serious symptoms emerge, hospitalization likely. Day 29 to 30, organ failure, death appears natural. There was even a contingency plan for what Sandogo called post-termination management, a media campaign that would attribute the president's death to the stress of economic reforms and use the tragedy to justify inviting French advisors back to restore stability. Under interrogation, Sandogo's carefully constructed facade crumbled within hours. Faced with irrefutable evidence and the knowledge that his French handlers had already begun distancing themselves from the operation, he revealed details of a conspiracy that reached far beyond Burkina Faso. Sandogo's confession revealed that he was part of a network called the Restoration, a group of African officials, military officers, and business leaders dedicated to reversing the wave of independence movements that had been sweeping French-speaking Africa. The network's ultimate goal was to return countries like Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger to their previous status as compliant French client states. The assassination of President Traoré was designed to be the first domino in a carefully planned sequence. Once he was dead, the restoration planned to attribute his death to extremist elements opposed to his reforms, declare a state of emergency due to political instability, invite French military forces back to restore order, install a transitional government composed of restoration members, gradually reverse Traoré's reforms and restore French economic control. The network included 3 other cabinet ministers, 7 military officers, and dozens of civil servants across multiple government agencies. But most alarmingly, Sandaogo revealed that similar networks operated in Mali, Niger, Guinea, and Chad, all coordinated by what he called the Paris Working Group. The Paris Working Group, according to Sandaogo's testimony, was an unofficial coordination body comprising French intelligence officers, military planners, and corporate executives from major French companies with African interests. Their mandate was to maintain French influence in Africa through any means necessary, including assassination, economic sabotage, and military intervention. President Traoré's response to these revelations was methodical and devastating. Rather than launching mass arrests that might trigger French military intervention, he chose surgical precision combined with maximum transparency. The conspirators were detained quietly over the course of a week, each arrest carefully documented with extensive evidence. Confessions were recorded, financial records were preserved, and the entire network was mapped in detail before any public announcements were made. Then, on October 20th, exactly 1 month after the poisoning had begun, President Traoré held a press conference that would change African politics forever. The setting was deliberately chosen, the same office where he had been slowly poisoned for 23 days. The air conditioning system had been completely replaced, but Traoré made a point of standing directly beneath the new vent as he addressed the assembled journalists, diplomats, and African heads of state who had flown in for the announcement. He held up a sealed vial containing a sample of the poison compound, letting the cameras focus on it for several long seconds. This is what they used: a modified nerve agent, diluted and dispersed through the air I breathed while working for our nation. They thought they were being clever, sophisticated, invisible. He set the vial down carefully and looked directly into the cameras. But they forgot something fundamental about Burkina Faso, something fundamental about Africa. We are not alone. We have each other. He gestured to Jacques Collier and Antoine Sawadogo, who were seated in the front row. A janitor with a chemistry degree noticed a smell that didn't belong. A young medical technician had the courage to test it. A security officer acted without hesitation. Ordinary Burkina-Faso citizens saved their president. Not because of who I am, but because of what we are building together. The international reaction was immediate and seismic. The use of a chemical weapon, even a modified one, against a head of state crossed every red line in international law. The African Union demanded a comprehensive investigation and imposed sanctions on any companies or individuals found to be involved. The UN Security Council held an emergency session, with even traditional French allies expressing shock at the sophistication and brazenness of the assassination attempt. The use of chemical weapons violated multiple international treaties, regardless of the political context. Most significantly, the revelation of the Restoration Network and the Paris Working Group triggered a wave of investigations across Africa. Presidents and prime ministers who had died under mysterious circumstances over the past decade were suddenly being re-examined. Bodies were exhumed, medical records were reviewed, financial transactions were traced. The results were horrifying. Captain Yamayogu's first intelligence report, classified but strategically leaked to sympathetic journalists, identified 17 suspicious deaths of African political leaders over the past 10 years. Most had never been publicly questioned, with deaths attributed to heart attacks, tropical diseases, or accidents. But when examined with knowledge of the restoration's methods, patterns emerged. Leaders who opposed French corporate interests, deaths that conveniently preceded policy reversals, successor governments that mysteriously became more compliant with French demands. The French government's response followed a predictable pattern: complete denial, followed by limited admissions, followed by claims of rogue elements acting without authorization. But the evidence was overwhelming, documented in excruciating detail, and corroborated by multiple independent sources. Financial records showed systematic payments to network members over several years. Communications intercepts revealed coordination between French intelligence services and the Restoration. The technical sophistication of the poison itself could only have been produced in a military-grade laboratory with resources available only to nation-states. International pressure forced the French government to conduct its own investigation, which resulted in the quiet dismissal of several intelligence officers and the closure of certain African operations. But no senior officials faced prosecution, and France's fundamental approach to African policy remained unchanged. Constellation Mining Corporation faced more serious consequences. International sanctions destroyed its African operations, while lawsuits filed in multiple jurisdictions sought billions of dollars in damages. Several company executives were indicted by the International Criminal Court for conspiracy to commit assassination using chemical weapons. The company eventually declared bankruptcy, its African assets nationalized by various governments. Paul Bungu, the technician who had actually installed the poison dispensing system, was found 3 months later in a shallow grave outside Abidjan. He had been shot execution style, presumably to prevent him from providing testimony that might implicate higher-level operatives. His death came too late to prevent justice, however. His confession, recorded during the brief period between his initial arrest and his lawyer's arrival, had provided crucial technical details about the assassination plot. The modified air conditioning unit that had nearly killed President Traoré is now permanently displayed in the Museum of Sovereignty in Ouagadougou. Alongside it are the mass spectrometer readings that detected the poison, the original vial of chemical compound, and Jacques Collier's handwritten maintenance report, the first document to officially record suspicions about the assassination attempt. A plaque beneath the exhibit reads, "For 23 days, death flowed through these vents. But vigilance, courage, and solidarity flowed stronger." The museum has become a pilgrimage site for visitors from across Africa, many of whom leave notes thanking Jacques, Antoine, and Captain Yamayogu for their courage. School groups from other countries regularly visit to learn about the plot and its exposure, turning the story into a teaching moment about the importance of civic vigilance. President Traoré recovered fully from the poisoning, though doctors confirmed he had been perhaps 72 hours from permanent neurological damage when treatment began. In his memoirs, published several years later, he wrote, "I have faced guns, bombs, and military coups, but the poison in the air taught me the most valuable lesson of my political career. Our enemy's greatest weapon is their belief that we won't notice, won't understand, won't act. Jacques Collier proved them wrong." The exposure of the Restoration Network triggered a continental awakening. African governments began implementing what became known as the Troy Protocols, comprehensive chemical detection systems for all government buildings, regular testing of air and water supplies, and most importantly, protection programs for whistleblowers and technical personnel. Jacques Collier became a continental hero, invited to speak at universities and security conferences across Africa. President Traoré personally awarded him the National Order of Valor and offered him any position he wanted in the government. Jacques chose to return to his original profession, becoming director of a new chemical security division, tasked with protecting government facilities from similar attacks. His first official act was to hire his nephew Antoine as deputy director, creating a family legacy of public service that redeemed the years of struggle following his blacklisting. Captain Beatrice Yameogu was promoted to general, the youngest in Burkina Faso's history, and appointed to lead a new Pan-African intelligence sharing network. Her mandate was to detect and prevent assassination attempts across the continent, with particular focus on the sophisticated techniques employed by foreign intelligence services. Perhaps most importantly, the psychological impact of the plot's exposure shattered the myth of French invincibility in Africa. If they could be caught attempting to assassinate a president with chemical weapons, what else were they capable of? What other operations had been successfully concealed over the decades? The poison itself became the subject of intensive scientific study. International forensic chemists who analyzed the compound described it as a masterpiece of malevolent chemistry. The substance was a hybrid creation, part organophosphate nerve agent, part time-release pharmaceutical, part environmental contaminant designed to degrade without trace. Dr. Sarah Mitchell, a chemical weapons expert from the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons, explained the diabolical sophistication. This wasn't just poison, it was an engineered biological time bomb. The compound was designed with multiple fail-safes to avoid detection. It metabolized slowly enough to avoid acute symptoms. It degraded into harmless components after 30 days to prevent post-mortem detection. And it was dispersed at such low concentrations that most detection systems would classify it as background contamination. The delivery system was equally sophisticated. Rather than a crude addition to the air conditioning system, the conspirators had installed a precision microdosing device that released exact quantities based on airflow patterns and room occupancy sensors. When President Traoré was in his office, the device activated. When he left, it shut down, conserving the poison supply and avoiding exposure to cleaning staff or visitors. Most chillingly, investigators found evidence that the system had been tested extensively. Climate Solutions International had installed similar air quality monitoring equipment in several other government buildings across Francophone Africa over the past 2 years. Some installations were apparently just surveillance devices, but others showed chemical residue patterns suggesting they had been used for similar assassination attempts. As investigations expanded across Africa, the restoration network began collapsing like a house of cards. Each arrested member provided information about others, creating an exponential expansion of the conspiracy's known scope. In Mali, similar chemical traces were found in the presidential palace's ventilation system, though the concentrations were lower, apparently a failed attempt or a test run. In Niger, financial records revealed payments to government officials identical to those found in Burkina Faso. In Chad, a French technical advisor was arrested attempting to flee the country with encrypted communications devices and samples of suspicious chemical compounds. The network's operational security had been compromised by its own success. Years of operating without detection had made the restoration members overconfident, sloppy with communication security, and careless about financial transfers. They had assumed African intelligence services were too unsophisticated to detect their activities, a racist assumption that proved to be their downfall. Colonel Amadou Diarra, the Malian officer who had been coordinating the restoration's military aspects, provided particularly damaging testimony after his arrest. Under questioning, he revealed that the network had been planning synchronized destabilization operations across 5 countries, with President Traoré's assassination serving as the trigger for a broader French reoccupation of the Sahel region. The plan was elegant in its simplicity, Diarra admitted during his interrogation. Traoré dies of apparent natural causes. Mali and Niger, already unstable, face increased insurgency funded through restoration channels. Chad's government comes under pressure from rebels equipped with French weapons. Guinea experiences economic collapse orchestrated through members in the finance ministry. Within 6 months, all 5 countries would be requesting French military intervention to restore order. The exposure of the assassination plot had an unexpected consequence that neither the Restoration nor President Traoré's government had anticipated. It galvanized Africa's youth in ways that traditional politics never could. University students across the continent organized what they called Vigilance Days, events where they tested their own dormitories and classrooms for chemical contamination, not because they expected to find anything, but as a symbolic act of taking responsibility for their own safety and freedom. The image of Jacques Caillet, a janitor with a chemistry degree, whose education had been weaponized against him by the colonial system, but who had ultimately used that same education to save his country, became a powerful symbol of African intellectual resilience. Students began wearing T-shirts with Jacques' image, and the slogan, "We are all janitors now," meaning that everyone, regardless of their station in life, had a responsibility to notice when something was wrong and act on their knowledge. At the University of Ouagadougou, chemistry students conducted public demonstrations showing how organophosphate compounds could be detected using simple equipment. They published their methods online, creating a continental network of citizen scientists capable of detecting similar assassination attempts. More significantly, these same students began applying similar analytical techniques to examine other aspects of French corporate presence in Africa. They tested water supplies near French-owned mines, analyzed soil samples from French agricultural operations, and documented environmental damage that had been systematically hidden from public view. What they found was a pattern of contamination, exploitation, and environmental destruction that made the assassination plot seem like just one symptom of a much larger disease. The poison plot's exposure gave President Traoré the political cover he needed to implement economic reforms that would have been impossible under normal circumstances. With clear evidence of French attempts to assassinate him, even moderate politicians who had previously opposed his more radical economic policies now supported comprehensive de-Franchisation of Burkina Faso's economy. The first target was the CFA franc, the colonial-era currency that kept 14 African countries economically tied to France. Using the assassination attempt as justification for enhanced economic sovereignty, Traoré announced Burkina Faso's withdrawal from the CFA franc zone and the creation of a new national currency backed by the country's gold reserves. The French response was swift and predictable. Economic sanctions, threats to international investors, and diplomatic pressure through international organizations. But the assassination plot had created a new political dynamic. Other African countries, fearing they might be the next targets of French destabilization efforts, began supporting Burkina Faso's economic independence as a matter of collective self-defense. Mali and Niger announced their own departures from the CFA franc zone. Guinea began renegotiating its mining contracts with French companies. Chad started requiring all foreign military advisors to submit to chemical weapons training, a diplomatic insult that made French officials furious but was impossible to refuse without appearing to support chemical warfare. Within 18 months, what had begun as an assassination plot had triggered the largest reduction in French economic influence in Africa since decolonization. One unexpected consequence of the investigation was the technical knowledge gained by African scientists and security professionals. The process of detecting, analyzing, and countering the chemical assassination attempt had forced rapid development of indigenous expertise in areas previously dominated by foreign consultants. Antoine Savadogo, the young toxicologist whose quick thinking had saved President Traoré's life, found himself at the center of a continental network of chemical security experts. The African Union funded the creation of a Pan-African Chemical Defense Institute, with Antoine as its founding director and Jacques Caillard as chief of field operations. The Institute's first project was developing low-cost chemical detection equipment that could be manufactured in Africa rather than imported from Europe or America. Using reverse engineering techniques applied to the German mass spectrometer that had detected the poison, African engineers created simplified but effective detection devices costing less than 1/10 the price of imported alternatives. More importantly, they began training programs that combined advanced chemistry with practical security awareness. Teams of African scientists traveled from country to country, teaching government workers, medical personnel, and even janitors how to recognize signs of chemical contamination. The program's motto, suggested by Jacques himself, was "Every nose is a detector, every brain is a laboratory." The assassination plot's exposure fundamentally changed how African countries interacted with former colonial powers. What had previously been private suspicions about French interference became documented, proven facts that could be cited in international forums. President Traoré leveraged this evidence skillfully in United Nations proceedings, African Union summits, and bilateral negotiations. When French officials complained about African countries' hostile policies towards French businesses, Traoré would simply reference the chemical weapons attack on his life and ask whether attempted assassination constituted normal business practice. The moral authority gained from surviving an assassination attempt while continuing to govern effectively gave Traoré unprecedented influence in international affairs. He became the de facto spokesperson for African independence movements, invited to address the European Parliament, the U.S. Congress, and the Chinese National Assembly about the realities of neo-colonial interference. His standard speech, refined through dozens of presentations, always included the same powerful conclusion. They tried to kill me with poison because they knew that bullets would create a martyr, and martyrs inspire revolutions. But they failed to understand that survival can be even more inspiring than martyrdom. I am alive, my country is free, and our revolution continues. Despite his public success, the assassination attempt left deep personal scars on President Traoré and those who had saved him. The knowledge that he had been breathing poison for 23 days while conducting normal presidential duties created a form of psychological trauma that took years to fully process. Jacques Caillé struggled with survivor's guilt, wondering how many other African leaders might have died from similar plots that went undetected. His daughter Aisha, now a successful engineer, later wrote about watching her father wake up screaming from nightmares about chemical smells and death in ventilation systems. Antoine Savadogo developed what his wife described as an obsessive need to test everything, food, water, air, for contamination. The young man who had once been confident in his scientific abilities now lived in constant fear that he might miss something, might fail to detect the next attempt. Captain Yamaogo, promoted to general, found herself responsible for continental security operations that kept her away from her family for months at a time. The success of preventing one assassination had made her indispensable for preventing others, but the constant pressure of knowing that failure meant death for African leaders created enormous stress. President Traoré, in his private moments, admitted to close friends that he sometimes found it difficult to breathe normally in his office, even with the completely replaced air conditioning system. The psychological association between his workspace and slow death proved impossible to fully overcome. Perhaps the most profound impact of the assassination plot was on the generation of African children who grew up hearing the story as a foundational narrative of their country's independent struggles. In schools across Africa, the story of Jacques Antoine and Captain Yamaogo became required curriculum, but it raised difficult questions that teachers struggled to answer. Children wanted to know why foreign countries would try to kill African leaders. They asked why some African officials had helped the assassination attempt. They wondered whether their own leaders might be targets of similar plots. These questions forced a continent-wide conversation about sovereignty, independence, and the ongoing legacies of colonialism that was more honest and comprehensive than anything that had occurred since the original independence movements of the 1960s. Educational curricula were revised to include more detailed instruction about chemical safety, critical thinking about foreign influence, and the importance of civic vigilance. Children learned to identify suspicious smells, unusual patterns, and signs of foreign interference as part of basic citizenship education. The generation that grew up with this education would prove remarkably resistant to the kind of foreign manipulation that had characterized African politics for decades. The modified organophosphate compound used in the assassination attempt became the subject of extensive scientific research, not to weaponize it further, but to develop better detection and treatment methods. The African Union funded a comprehensive research program led by African scientists to ensure that similar chemical weapons could never again be used successfully on the continent. Dr. Fatou Diop, a Senegalese chemist who led the research team, made several breakthrough discoveries while studying the compound. Her work led to the development of new antidotes for organophosphate poisoning that were more effective and less expensive than existing treatments. More importantly, her team's research revealed signatures that could identify chemical weapons designed for slow-acting assassination attempts. These detection methods were shared freely with medical personnel across Africa and eventually adopted by international organizations working to prevent chemical weapons proliferation. The ironic result was that France's attempt to develop an undetectable assassination weapon had ultimately led to African scientific advances that made all such weapons more detectable and treatable. Every October 9th, Burkina Faso now observes National Vigilance Day, commemorating Jacques Cayer's discovery of the sweet metallic smell that saved President Traoré's life. The holiday has been adopted by other African countries as a continent-wide celebration of citizen awareness and civic responsibility. The day begins with chemical safety demonstrations in schools and workplaces. Citizens are encouraged to report any suspicious smells, unusual activities, or signs of tampering with public infrastructure. Government buildings conduct comprehensive security reviews, and medical facilities review their chemical detection capabilities. But the day is also a celebration of ordinary people doing extraordinary things. Awards are given to citizens who have shown exceptional vigilance in protecting their communities. Students present research projects about scientific detection methods. Workers share stories about times when their expertise in their normal jobs helped identify broader problems. The central ceremony takes place at the Museum of Sovereignty, where Jacques, Antoine, and Captain Yamayogu, now General Yamayogu, give speeches about the ongoing importance of vigilance and community protection. President Traoré traditionally concludes the ceremony by reading from his office log for October 9, 2024, describing in his own words what it felt like to discover he had been breathing poison for 23 days. "I learned that morning," he always says, "that freedom has a smell. It smells like the sweat of ordinary people doing their jobs with extraordinary care. It smells like the courage of citizens who refuse to look away when something doesn't seem right. And sometimes, when you're very lucky, it smells like the sweet metallic warning that tells you death is in the air, but life is still possible if you act quickly enough." The exposure of the Restoration Network did not end French attempts to influence African politics, but it did make such attempts more difficult and more likely to be detected. Subsequent investigations found evidence of continued foreign interference operations, but they were generally less sophisticated and more quickly identified. The real victory was psychological and political. African leaders who might once have been intimidated by subtle threats or inducements now had clear evidence that foreign powers were willing to use any means necessary to maintain control. This knowledge made them more willing to resist pressure and more likely to coordinate with other African leaders for mutual protection. The Pan-African Intelligence Network established by General Yamayogu began detecting and preventing numerous attempted foreign interference operations. Chemical attacks were attempted against leaders in 3 other countries over the following years, but all were detected and stopped before causing harm. More importantly, the network began identifying and disrupting the financial systems that funded foreign interference operations. Shell companies were exposed, money laundering operations were shut down, and corrupt officials were arrested before they could carry out their missions. The story of the invisible death plot resonated far beyond Africa, inspiring vigilance movements in other regions that had experienced foreign interference. In Latin America, citizens began monitoring their own leaders for signs of similar attacks. In Southeast Asia, chemical detection programs were established in government buildings. International organizations revised their protocols for investigating suspicious deaths of political leaders. The World Health Organization developed new guidelines for medical professionals to identify potential chemical weapons attacks disguised as natural illnesses. Most significantly, the International Criminal Court established new precedents for prosecuting chemical weapons attacks against political leaders. The successful prosecution of several Constellation Mining executives created legal frameworks that made corporate involvement in assassination attempts more risky and more likely to result in severe penalties. Years later, when historians analyze the turning point in Africa's relationship with its former colonial powers, many point to October 9, 2024, the day a janitor noticed a smell that didn't belong. Jacques Caillet, now in his 60s and director of Continental Chemical Security Operations, still makes his rounds through government buildings across Africa. But now he carries sophisticated detection equipment and is accompanied by trained technicians. His expertise, once dismissed and marginalized, is now recognized as essential for protecting African sovereignty. Antoine Ouedraogo leads the Pan-African Chemical Defense Institute, training new generations of scientists in the techniques needed to detect and counter chemical weapons. His students come from every African country, creating a continental network of technical expertise that makes future assassination attempts far more difficult. General Beatrice Yamiogu commands intelligence operations that have prevented dozens of foreign interference attempts across Africa. Her networks extend into European and American intelligence agencies, providing early warning of planned operations against African leaders. President Ibrahim Traoré completed his second term and stepped down voluntarily, establishing a precedent for peaceful democratic transitions that has been followed by other African leaders. He now leads a continental foundation dedicated to supporting civic vigilance and citizen protection programs. But perhaps the most important legacy of the invisible death plot is the lesson it taught about the power of ordinary people to protect extraordinary things. A janitor's nose, a technician's training, and a security officer's courage proved more effective than advanced technology and international protection. The poison in the air was real, but so was the antidote. Citizens who cared enough to notice, skilled enough to understand, and brave enough to act. In the end, the sweet metallic smell that should have been the harbinger of death became instead the fragrance of freedom, a reminder that vigilance is the price of independence, and that sometimes the most important revolutions begin with someone simply paying attention to what doesn't belong. The assassination plot failed not because of advanced technology or international protection, but because Africa remembered how to breathe together, and in that shared breath detected the poison meant to kill its dreams. Today, when visitors tour the Museum of Sovereignty and see the air conditioning unit that nearly killed a president, they often ask their guides the same question. How did they know to suspect something was wrong? The answer, carved in stone above the museum's entrance, comes from Jacques Caillet himself. When you love something enough to clean it every day for 11 years, you learn to recognize when someone is trying to poison it. And in that recognition, a continent found its freedom.